I'm Lloyd Holiday, and this is the Cost of a Thing podcast. Thanks for listening in today. The cost of a thing is the amount of time that you must spend working to buy the things that you want and need. And that directly determines your standard of living. As I discussed in the introductory podcast number 1, I believe that the standard of living of the 1960s in America was better than the one that we have today. And that is especially true for young people who are trying to form households and start families. And another way to put a reduction in standard of living is that with a lower standard of living, you're working harder, you're working more, and you're getting less. So working harder and more, and you're getting less for the money that you get for your work. And when you get ripped off financially, you're going to get less for that money that you got for your hard work. So that's why I'm focusing on the ripoffs in these next podcasts. So I'll be doing my next 10 podcasts on the top 10 biggest economic ripoffs in the United States that are affecting our standard of living negatively. I call these the super ripoffs. And the first super ripoff is overpriced houses and rents. Overpriced housing is the absolute biggest standard of living destroyer. And this standard of living destruction from overpriced housing especially affects the young people who are just getting out of high school or just graduating college, and they're in their 20s or even in their 30s, some of them. And they don't have the income yet to afford a $500,000 house in many of these, that is the normal price in many of these areas, or a $1,200 a month one-bedroom apartment. And because the housing ripoff is so large and so complex and so important, I'm going to be doing 2 podcasts on the housing ripoff, part 1 and part 2. So I can try to keep these podcasts at 10 or 12 minutes or so. And even with 2 parts, I won't be able to get into the details of everything about the housing ripoff. I'm going to be outlining the main points of it. And of course, in the future, I'm going to be doing many more podcasts that'll get into the details of the whole thing. So let's begin by defining this housing ripoff. And to do that, we need a frame of reference. And the frame of reference that I'm going to use here is all of history up through the 1960s. And during that entire period, a house or housing would cost, to buy a house would cost 2 to 3 times the average person's annual income to buy that average house in any area. So if an average person in some community is making a $40,000 salary for the year, a new house in that area, by historical standards, by the reference we're using, should cost between 2 and 3 times that $40,000. So that would be $80,000 to approximately $120,000. Well, we know that there's not very many new homes selling in the United States anywhere for $80,000 to $120,000, but there's a lot of guys making $40,000 a year. So we can kind of start to see the problem here. Now we're starting to see something has happened. The prices of houses have inflated while incomes have stayed stagnant or low. And in many parts of the United States, the coastal areas, California, Oregon, Washington State, Seattle, you can go down the East Coast, all those expensive areas, and even in the interior, some of the expensive cities. You're looking at the average house is costing 5, 10, 15, maybe even 20 times what the average person's income there is. This is the problem. This is the ripoff. And now I want to talk about how this housing ripoff got started and where it got started. And I think it's easy to see that it started in the heavily populated areas of California and New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles, and the New York City area, where lots of people were moving in there and lots of jobs were there, and the land is very limited. These are very land-limited areas. The San Francisco Bay Area, there's only so much land around there. Same with Los Angeles. You got the ocean and the mountains kind of blocking you into that one little valley area along the coast. And then you have in New York City, Manhattan Island and the same kind of thing occurring there. And this started around the early 1970s. Like I say, before that in the 60s, pricing was pretty much like the historical norms had been. This started in the early 1970s, maybe 75, and it's continued and snowballed and gotten worse since then. And I call this housing ripoff, and it's spread to other states, Californization. And here is how the process of Californization works. People from California who can't afford the high prices there for either houses or rents end up moving to other states. And that creates that demand in those other states. And then, of course, the price of houses goes up there. And more importantly, other people who actually sell their bubble house in California, their overpriced house, and get this giant windfall, usually hundreds of thousands of dollars, of really free money. No work was done for this money, and nothing was produced for this money. They just get it. And they take that big bag full of money to these other states, and again, that really pushes up the demand and then the prices of houses in those other states. And that's how this process of Californization goes forward. And this in turn, like a chain reaction, it moves from the areas in these other states to even more states in the same way. And this is the insidious way in which this spreads, much like a cancer. It destroys the standard of living as it goes, because when these new areas get their houses prices and rents up, they go up really high, then the people who live there have a hard time affording houses and rents also. And on it goes. So we can see that there is a supply and demand component to these high house prices. And just briefly, the law of supply and demand, it's an economic law that basically states that if the supply of something is low or the demand is high, then the prices rise. Or if the supply of something is very high and the demand is low, well, the prices will drop. And of course, we've probably all heard people say that, yeah, the high house prices are just, they're just supply and demand, it's just, the supply is low and the demand is high, so the prices go up, and we make a lot of money. Well, but there's much more to it than just a simple free market supply and demand situation here. The law of supply and demand, in this case, in the housing ripoff case, has been corrupted. It's been corrupted by certain vested interests and influences that, of course, benefit from the high house prices. There's federal government involved. The state governments are involved. The local governments are involved. And there's bankers, there's speculators involved, and various other groups and influences. And in part 2 of the Great Housing Ripoff, we're going to talk about all that and also more of who's benefiting, specifically who's benefiting from the housing ripoff, and some other things. But this is all for part 1, and if you're interested in this, I hope you come back and listen to part 2 of the Housing Ripoff podcasts. So this is Lloyd Holiday and The Cost of a Thing, signing off.